I'm Kristen. I have either met or feel like I know now most of you. So that's awesome. And we're going to chat a little bit about retrospectives today. I pasted a link to a Jamboard in the Zoom chat because I was asking myself, like, what is the simplest thing that could possibly work? There's lots of different tools that you can use when you're talking about retrospectives. And like, that's not going to be the focus of today because that's not really the basics. Like, tools can show you what's possible, but it's not about what tools you use or don't use. It's about the ideas, about the feelings, and the tools can just help make you successful in that. So I'll just share my screen really quick in case you've not seen Jamboard before. Here's my face. I get really excited when somebody says retrospectives. And Amy, this might look really familiar to you because this was yesterday at the track meet. Amy's and my sons are very good friends, and we were both at track meet yesterday. So in Jamboard, real quick, before we go through anything else, up here, there's numbered frames. And if you go back to the first frame, that's the parking lot. So if you think of something while we're chatting and you want to talk about it or something like that, feel free to just like grab a sticky over here on the left-hand side, pick whatever color you would like, and drop that sticky on the parking lot. And we'll circle back to those a little bit later. So before we get into too many things, I get really excited about retrospectives. They are my favorite. I'm interested to know, and I'll stop sharing after I show you this next slide, but if you go to slide 3, interested to know, like, what does retrospective mean to you? So if you'll just take a minute and think about, what does retrospective mean to you? Drop a sticky on there or an image. You could also, there's a little option on the left-hand side to do a Google search on an image too. So you're welcome to do that.
Oh, I'm sorry, honey. No, you're more important.
Cool. I'm seeing getting better, figuring out impediments, recognizing accomplishments, a time to praise and a time to grumble. Love it. Continuous improvement, also my favorite. Opportunity to reflect back, finding out how the team can improve.
Awesome. I find it interesting that when you add a sticky, that it adds them all in the same place. It shouldn't, in my opinion.
If you are the only person adding stickies and you continue to add stickies, it will add them next to each other, and then it will go to the next row. But if other people are adding stickies, it all just starts in the same place. Ooh, we got another one on here about finding out and acknowledging strengths and weaknesses. Great. And a space to share. Absolutely. So you'll notice that, in all of these Agile things that we do, we have ceremonies, we have things like retrospective. A retrospective is just a container. It's just a space that we create to intentionally focus on improvements and getting better. All of these things that all of you just added to this Jamboard around acknowledging strengths and weaknesses, giving us time to praise and time to grumble. It's a container where we can do that. The heart of retrospectives is really that continuous improvement. And you don't need a retrospective, a facilitated conversation to improve necessarily. But sometimes you do. So if we go to the next slide, slide 4, I was like, we got to talk about getting back to basics because that's what I said we were going to do here. We're going to go back to basics. But really the question is, which basics? It's actually a lot of like back to basics when you think about it for retrospectives. So we got to the heart of it, the selfish heart of it, which is relentless continuous improvement. That's the biggest thing. But depending on who you are, where you're sitting, whether or not you're facilitating or participating, the basics of what a retrospective is can be different. So quick show of hands, like who facilitates retrospectives more than they participate? Got 1.5. I'm going to imagine Tim's hand is up too. So 2.5. Okay, cool. So for reference, one of the basics when you're thinking about like facilitating retrospectives, I always like to go back to like the 5 stages of a retrospective. So the first thing, and I'm just going to add this live because if we were in a room, I would just be writing on a whiteboard. So the first thing we do is we set the stage. We check in, we chat, we get everybody talking. There's lots of different ways to do this. You can ask people how they're feeling. Are they mad, sad, glad, or afraid, or afraid if you want it all to rhyme? You can, do an icebreaker question. Today, actually, during our stand-up, one of the other coaches on my team asked us all, if you were forced to do karaoke, what would your karaoke song be? Anybody want to offer theirs? Because now I'm curious about all of your karaoke songs. You're all on mute still, except for Amy. So just FYI, in case you were trying to tell me.
I'm not sure. I always try to stay away from karaoke. So that's a hard question.
I was gonna say anything Britney Spears or Christina Aguilera. Obviously 2 total things, but yeah.
Classic. Mine is pretty much any Dixie Chicks song. You can totally rock the karaoke for that.
Early in the career or later in the career?
It could go either way. We could do Goodbye Earl or oh no, now I'm thinking of Shadazy songs, but there's those too. Nobody knows those ones. Makes it even better.
That's a jam.
Hmm?
Wide Open Spaces.
Yeah, you do some Wide Open Spaces. Good times. Ready to Run.
Yeah.
All right, well now I got Teapot singing. So we've clearly set the stage. The next thing that you want to do, like from a facilitation standpoint, and if you've been in well-facilitated retrospectives, you'll notice this has happened. You'll gather some data. That data could be, emotional data, like how are people feeling in the moment? How have they felt over the last 2 weeks of your sprint? How have you felt over the course of this 2-year project potentially? Depending on the scope of your retrospective, but so it could be those feelings, which are just as valid as the hard facts and the numbers. I used to work with a developer who was like, I like seeing all the numbers. Can you show us burn down charts and give us all the numbers? Sure, Ramesh, I can totally do that. All about it. So sometimes, as a facilitator, you can bring data into your retrospective. You don't have to gather it there. But either way, you want to get some data, whether it's hard numbers or if it's facts and figures, or if it's just stuff that happens. Well, on this day, my cat ran away. And on this day, we released this thing in prod. And then on this day, we had to do a hot fix. It could be events, it could be feelings, it could be, people joining or leaving your team. Lots of different types of data you can gather during a retrospective or gather beforehand and review together as a group in the retrospective. The next thing you do with that because like what is data if you can't use it to turn it into information? So from there, your team can generate some insights. And you'll notice as I'm adding these stickies, it does like add them separated out, but I'm going to move them around anyway. So generating insights that's the meat of your retrospective. Like that's the hard part, right? This is where it gets difficult, because generating insights is where you really have the conversation, and it's really where you need to apply your critical thinking skills. So like from a facilitation standpoint, this is where you're probably going to expect to spend the most time in your retrospective, is having this conversation and like coming up with ideas, seeing what kinds of insights your team can pull out of the data that they now have in front of them when everyone's level set on the same data. Which is often also where like difficult retrospectives, when you've been in them and you've had somebody struggling to facilitate, or you personally have struggled to facilitate, it's usually when people don't have that level set experience. They're not you haven't, like, you may have tried to set the stage and gather some data, but if you can't get your team into that mindset of a shared experience, and seeing things from others' perspectives, even if it's like, well, I realized I had an awesome 2 weeks and Teresa had like a terrible 2 weeks. I might not have known that. And she might have just been like, that jerk face. Like, why is she in such a good mood all the time? But I don't know. I mean, that probably happened, I'm sure, when we were on the same team back in the day. But if we can get into retrospective and talk about like, yeah, Teresa's been having a really rough 2 weeks. I've been having an awesome 2 weeks, but oh my gosh, I was so clouded by my own rays of sunshine that I didn't see that she was having a bad day. Then, that's realization, wake up call to me too, to say like, oh, hey, maybe be a little more aware of your teammates. But now we all know that like you had good days, you had bad days. We can see where can we go from here? So like once you started to realize some of these insights, that's when you can really decide what to do, which is kind of the next thing. And figure out where to go from here. Come up with some action items that are actually actionable. So many of you have probably heard me say that, but coming up with actionable action items, like decide something to do. And when I say something, like one thing, maybe two, maybe. But like one thing that's really actionable, that's going to be key, because if you come up with a list of like 15 action items, you're not going to do all those, not in the next 2 weeks, or not on the next project. Like you might have this whole list of lessons learned, and that's great. Those are great insights when you come up with that big old list of lessons learned. But like, what are you going to actually do going into the next thing? That's key. And that's what really like keeps us going with continuous improvement and retrospectives, is not just having, pardon my French, a bitch session, but like really doing something about it. And like sometimes you have to have what we, when I was at Vertifor, used to like to call Retrospectives. Like sometimes you just need to get it out and air the grievances, like we talked about before we got started. And get that out of everybody's system. But then really the next step is to figure out like, okay, so what do we do next? How do we make that actionable? And then from a facilitation standpoint, the last thing, and the thing that gets missed most often, is really like closing your retrospective. And this is great to think about from the meta standpoint of like getting feedback on how you facilitated a retrospective, or giving feedback on how the retrospective went. Like, was this a valuable use of our time? And it can also just be like a way to wrap things up and like get everybody out of the room feeling better. So you can always do like appreciations or snaps or flowers or whatever you like to call them. And just, like for instance, I appreciate Teresa for asking me to talk about retrospectives over my lunch hour. I love talking about retrospectives. So thank you. That's an example of appreciation, and a sincere one at that. All right, so that's from a facilitation standpoint. Now, that was, to the 2.5 people who raised their hands and said, like, I got to facilitate these things. But now as participants, you kind of know what to look for. But what are some of the other basics? Well, another basic of the retrospective, like I said, that like selfish lens of getting better all the time, you gotta feel like you can, right? Like you have to feel safe. You have to feel safe to have a conversation, to get better. There's actually a lot of psychological safety that needs to be present in a team for them to really get the benefits out of retrospectives that are going to really help them. Like not just the surface level stuff. Oh, we completed 7 out of 10 story points. We should really complete 10 out of 10 next time. How can we do that? Well, maybe we can break our stories down smaller. Okay. I mean, that can be exciting when a team realizes like, oh, maybe we should break shit down smaller. Yes. That's awesome. But it can be really surface level, right? Like if you really want to be on that like high performing team, you've got to feel safe. So there's a website I really like called Modern Agile. It's just a great take on some of the Agile values. And one is just making people awesome. And another one is experiment and learn rapidly. And then there's making safety a prerequisite and deliver value continuously. That's another thing you have to think about with retrospectives is like getting really back to basics. Delivering value is part of our job, which means that taking the time to retrospect is part of the work. You all know this. I'm talking to people who do quality stuff for a living. Like, like testing is part of the work. It is not a bolt-on afterthought. Like you have to build quality in. And that's really part of the back to basics of retrospectives is that this is a quality practice. This is how we continuously improve and how we continue to make not only our products higher quality, but our people and our process higher quality as well. So, I mean, if you needed more fuel for that fire, I'm sure y'all didn't because but just in case you did, we're going to add that as a sticky that retrospectives are a quality practice. Awesome. Another set of values they'll highlight actually are the Scrum values, because those really can help us think about where we need to ground ourselves, like as a participant heading into a retrospective. And as you might have like 87 other things going on, most of us are still working from home. You have children or pets or roommates or spouses or neighbors, people running leaf blowers or mowing the lawn, whatever is happening over at your house, Amber. You've got things happening and other stuff going on, and it might be really hard to be present in a retrospective. And it might take like some intentional, as a participant who's saying like, you can show up even better for your retrospective by trying to ground yourself. So quick pop quiz. Does anybody remember the Scrum values? There are 5 and you don't have to remember all of them.
Oh, geez. I know there's people over process.
Single words.
Oh, I was thinking,
You were thinking the manifesto.
yes, I am. There's courage and commitment and, oh, hell. Wow. I should be ashamed of myself. I've completely forgotten all of them.
No, you shouldn't. I'm impressed you remembered too. it's taken me years to actually like remember all of these and commit them to memory in a way that I could recite them. So Tim called out courage, commitment. Anybody else got one? There's also focus, openness, and respect. Respect. So courage was the big one, actually, that I wanted to touch on, because that's something that even so, like I'm on a team of coaches now. I'm on like a team of Agile coaches, which obviously is a dream for me. But it's interesting to be like in a team when for like the last 10 years, or at least half of the last 10 years, so like the last 5 years, I haven't really necessarily had like a team. So being on a team of coaches, like we definitely have opinions and we have thoughts and we have ways of working and ways that we're interacting on our engagements and on the services we're working to develop. And I had to ground myself like last week to think about like, I don't know. I'm like, I don't know if I really want to bring this up. I don't know if I want to talk about this. Who are you? What do you mean you don't want to bring this up? Like, have the courage to bring up the thing, to be open. Now, getting back to the psychological safety aspect, you might not feel safe doing that in a room full of people. Maybe you're doing a big project or release retrospective and you're like, yeah, I don't want to see that in front of those people because they might take it the wrong way. Okay. Gotta find, like, there's the fight your battles, pick your battles part, but you also gotta find that way for you. Like, and this is a personal thing, showing up to a retrospective, you gotta find that way to be able to get your voice out there. As a facilitator, that's always my goal, is to hear every voice, to get everybody involved and engaged and able to feel safe to share what they really truly think. Because I would really like to know what you really truly think. I don't want to hear what you think I want to hear. I want to know your true feelings. That's what I want to hear. Kelly knows this is true. We've had that conversation many times. But I mean, that's also something to think about, like back to basics, showing up to a retrospective and grounding your team too. You might not be the one facilitating, but you can always say what's happening in the room. Like if you're noticing something, you're feeling icky because you're like, oh, this conversation, like everyone's starting to get uncomfortable. Just pointing out that this is starting to seem uncomfortable can let other people go, oh yeah, you're right. I'm getting really frustrated by this. On the flip side, everybody's getting excited and being able to say like, hey, it looks like there's a lot of excitement around this. We said we wanted this thing to be our action item, but more people seem excited about this. Like, should we do this instead? Cool. Like having the courage to ask those questions, and to, do it with respect. Like if we're leaning back on the Scrum values, like being open, being respectful, and helping the team focus, like you don't have to be the one facilitating the retrospective to do that. And I think I already said, like, it's not about the tools. The tools can help. There are lots of tools out there. We're using Jamboard today because for me, it's like the simplest thing that could possibly work. But as a facilitator, or even if you're looking not as a retrospective facilitator, but just like for some other team tools, there's great stuff out there, not only online retrospective tools, like Retrium and Easy Retro and Parable, and I can give you all a list of links if you're interested in looking at them. There's also like Miro, and there's Lucid Spark, and there's other like virtual collaboration tools, online whiteboards. Apparently Teams has a whiteboard that's built in. It's terrible, especially if you're on a Mac, but I digress, because it's not about the tools, right? It's about what we're doing with them. And if you are facilitating a session, retrospective, official retrospective or not, in this virtual space, especially, just make sure you're familiar with the tool that you're using. So if you need to find a pilot, like a little test group, do that. But I feel like I'm, talking about testing things out. I'm preaching to the choir again. So there's that. But yeah, it's really, being part of retrospectives, it's about showing up curious, right? And like, I know that that's a Vertifor value. And so all of my Verti friends are laughing at me right now, but it's honestly like, that's what it's about. Like, have the curiosity and experiment and see what you can learn. So those are the basics I wanted to talk about. What basics am I missing? What did you want to hear? I'm not totally done. I have other things to say. I have lots of things to say, but what else did you want to hear, or what else do you want to know about?
The different formats, if that's not already something else that you're going to talk about, but I think people kind of get into the rut of always doing the same format of retro all the time, and they just like, because it's easy and takes the least amount of time to like prep and all of that stuff. So I think that's one thing.
Yeah. So everybody knows the basic format, right? Like, what should we keep doing? What should we stop doing? What should we change? Cool. I can tell from your faces that really engages you in a retrospective. So there are different ways to look at it, and every facilitator has their go-to. Mine is only slightly different from that. It's the one I really like. It's called the Learning Matrix. And if you're looking for a book recommendation, Agile Retrospectives, Making Good Teams Great, Esther Derby and Diana Larson. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that book, because it is my like retrospective know-all. Like, it's what I always go back to if I need ideas or inspiration. And in there, one of the exercises called the Learning Matrix, and it's like smiley face, frowny face, light bulb, flowers. Things we liked, things we didn't like, ideas, and appreciations. So it's like a little spin on that keep, stop, change. But I don't just walk into a room and tell people to start writing stuff on sticky notes and we do that, right? Like, when you think about those stages of the retrospective, you still want to set the stage. Like, you still want to do something to get everyone engaged and, able to speak in the beginning, and to like set up where you're going. Maybe you set a goal for the retrospective, not a leading you into an answer goal, but like, we're here to work on some of our teamsiness, because we've all been off on our own like projects lately, and we're trying to like become more cohesive. Like, maybe that's our goal in our retrospective. Our goal could be that, we want to repair some relationships and focus on flow, because we noticed a lot of bottlenecks during the past 2 weeks. And so, then you could gather data around like, what kind of bottlenecks did we have and what is the impact of those, and have those conversations. So a retrospective doesn't have to be that like 3-column format, or, even a 4-column format. It can kind of be whatever you want it to be. Those ones are easy and they're structured. And I'm not saying a retrospective shouldn't be structured. It should be. But it doesn't have to fall into sticky notes and columns, or columns in a wiki table, or columns in a spreadsheet, or on your Word document, or your PowerPoint slide, or whatever. This is why I like virtual whiteboards, because you get a little more freedom in your collaboration space. Another thing I've actually found really beneficial recently is letting people write, like physically write stuff down, or they can type it if they want to, if you don't want to physically write things. But, giving people kind of an opportunity to journal sometimes, and to really like get their thoughts out, that can be useful. you always want to look for that balance too of giving the people who need time to think in order to talk. You want to balance that with people like me who talk in order to think. Some of us get clearer, as we speak. Some of us need to get clarity before we speak. And you want to make sure you build in those opportunities in your retrospectives too. Another activity that can be fun is to play a game that can give you some insights. So I have not tried to do this one in a virtual space, but like we've actually, Tifas, you might remember this because I failed at facilitating it miserably. But there's like an apples to apples style game you could play with your team, and you write your own response cards so like you have the deck of adjectives. What are those? The green cards. And then everybody writes their own set of red cards based on what happened during a sprint. And then you like play the cards. So like I said, I've not done that virtually. I'm not quite sure how that would work. But like things that could be a little more gamified can be fun. You do have to think about the people on your team though. And if they're big gamers and they like to know the rules and they want to know how they win, maybe stay away from the games. Because I think that's where I fell down too on that one. I was really bad at that, but Emily loved doing that one. So let's see. Trying to think of like other fun things. There's lots of different things, but it doesn't have to be that 3-column format. And in fact, like if you're facilitating a retrospective, or if you have the opportunity to influence your retrospective facilitator, if you've been kind of in that standard format for a while, ask them to switch it up a little. Think about doing something that might be different. What else?
I don't know if this is basics, but it kind of relates to what you asked about, like when there's lots of things people say they should improve on, like, and picking an action item, and how is it best to then make sure the team come back to it?
I would totally consider that basics, because basic retrospective 101 says don't walk out with too many action items, or else you're not going to do any of them. So one way, especially when a lot of things have been popular on a team, one way I've gotten folks to, home in on one thing is to dot vote. Everybody gets so many votes. And the thing with the highest votes wins. We're going to do that one first, but then the rest of the things can be on our continuous improvement backlog. And when they come up, like, okay, this was the next thing on the backlog, and we did the first thing. Do we still want to do this next thing, or do we want to wait? Do we want to reevaluate? And I've also found that making that work visible, like if it is something that you want to, we want to write more test cases, actually in the code, like more unit tests. We want to make sure we have a higher unit test code coverage. Okay, cool. Task that out, like make that work visible on your board as part of your work. So like to me, the like limiting your action item focus and making your work visible, yeah, I would say that's totally the basics, but people forget to do it a lot. It's easy to get done with your retrospective, put your action items up on a wiki page, and then forget about them for 2 weeks. Like happens all the time. So the more you can do to make that work visible, the better you're going to have success in actually following through on those action items. Does that answer your question?
Oops. Yep, it did. Thank you. I was on mute.
Excellent. I mean, it wouldn't be a Zoom meeting if we weren't talking on mute.
Exactly. And I'm on my phone. It makes it all stranger.
Right? Absolutely. All right. So one other thing I wanted to mention is a nice segue from from talking about action items and like how to actually do stuff is on slide 5. You'll see what I like to call sphere of influence. It's not a sphere, it's a couple of circles technically. It's also called circles and soup. But what you'll see here is when you do come up with a lot of action items or a lot of things, and your team is trying to decide like, well, what should we do or what could we do? A good lens to look through is, well, what do we have control over? What do we have influence over? And what can we just choose our reaction to? And I've found a lot of times, especially when you are on a team that's kind of feeling put upon, downtrodden, disempowered, and you're like, I mean, basically that's when you get into your like bitch fest style retrospectives. If you put it through that lens and say like, okay, we're saying all these things. What do we actually have control over? What can we do? And you go through each sticky note individually, what can we do about this? And you can see how much stuff are we complaining about that we need to maybe choose a different reaction to versus what can we actually influence? Like, can we influence the priority of items on the backlog? Well, let's like really critically think about that. Well, can we talk to our product owner? You know, can we understand what the stakeholder priorities are going into planning? Like, what can we do? Can we at least like influence that conversation? Can we tell them the impact it has on us when you change your mind 17 times the day before we start the sprints, or the day before we go into planning, or whatever? Like, what conversation can we have there that is productive? Or like, what can we control? You know, maybe it's nobody's updating stuff on the task board. Team, peeps, we have control. Move your tasks across the board. We can do it. We can, Teapots. We can. You look skeptical for a second, and I know it's just your face, but so looking at you know, your action items through that lens can also help a team prioritize too. Like, you can definitely decide what has the biggest impact on the team and what is closest to something you can control. I mean, it's almost like if anybody's familiar with WSJF or, you know, something like that, like what is the highest amount of impact for the lowest amount of effort that we can do here? And you can, you know, you can look at things that come out of your retrospective like that too. And one other thing, just because I have to say this, is this sphere of influence is also an opportunity to see the system and to see where you fit. Because when you're in a retrospective and you are like introspecting, sometimes you get really focused on yourself or on your team, and that's good, like that's the point. But when you lose sight of how your team contributes to the system or how you as a person contribute to your team, and not just like how the team contributes to you, there's a JFK quote in there somewhere, but like you'll end up making potentially like local optimizations that might feel better for you, but aren't better for us. Like, they're not better for the system. So that's just something like that might be next level. That might be beyond the basics a little bit, but just, you know, something to keep in mind when it feels like we keep doing stuff and we feel like we're getting better, but it doesn't feel like it's all getting better. It might be time to, you know, take a step back and take more of a systems view of what's happening in your space and with your team and with the teams they work with and the teams they work with and so on. So yeah, that is what I had. If you look at slide 6, it has my Twitter handle and Lansing Code Slack handle on there. That is me. And I think we ended up with a couple extra slides at the end. Also cool. That happens in Jamboard. And I'm gonna head back and check the parking lot real quick. Nope, nothing. Like there's a way to hear how things are going and find improvement opportunities. So this one ended up here, but I think was on the what does retrospectives mean for you? I think it was intended for that. So what other questions do you have? Well, are there basics that we missed, or are there, 102 topics that you want to get into?
Hi, Kristen. This is Amy again. What's a good way to engage people that are not opening up and sharing their truths in meetings, in the retrospectives?
Great question. Trust isn't built in the meeting. It's built in between, right? Like the music happens in between the notes. So in that case, like trying to engage people in a meeting, like when you have that trust and you have that safety, I think that goes back to like giving people time to think, quiet time to think before folks are talking. And then also letting folks who need to talk a little bit. But really, like if you're noticing a pattern of like somebody's not engaging, or like they have things to say and they're not saying anything, even when you try to give them opportunities or make openings, I would work on that, one-on-one, on the side, even just to say like, hey, I noticed you were going to say something and then you didn't. And then we asked you what you were going to say and you were like, nah, I didn't want to say it. What was it? And if you know that like you feel comfortable speaking up, you can help model that for them and help give them even more of an opening to contribute. Teresa and I were actually just talking yesterday about giving people time to write sticky notes and then not having them read their own stickies, but as a facilitator, reading the sticky notes so that people can get their ideas out there, but it doesn't necessarily have to be their voice who opens the conversation. So that can be another way. You can always try and gather some opinions or data or thoughts before you head in and then share what you heard. I've seen a lot of, especially in a virtual space, I've seen a lot of people, if you don't already have survey fatigue, send like a survey to be like, what are the things you really want to bring up that you don't want to say? And then, you can say those things as the facilitator, and that like, I don't know, I'm not the person saying this, I'm just reading the words, see what reaction you get. Does that help, Amy?
It does. Yeah, thank you. I really like that, having people write things down and somebody else delivering them. I like that a lot.
Mm-hmm. It really can help, make the space feel safer, I think. I don't know. Those of you who have been in a retrospective that I've run before, I would love your take on that practice.